Good evening, everyone, and welcome to DIA. My name is Matilde Guidelli. I'm a curator here and the organizer of the Artist on Artist lecture series, where since 2001 we invite an artist to reflect upon the work of another artist in DIA's collection and past program. And I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's event featuring Paul Pfeiffer and Bruce Nauman. A few thank yous are due to everyone who helped make this event possible. In particular, Rebecca Cleman and Carl McCool at TAI, Alexis Johnson at Paula Cooper Gallery, Paul Pfeiffer Studio, Emily, Ella, Max, Kim, and the visitor service team at DIA, and most especially Bruce Nauman. DIA's relationship with Nauman began in 2000 with an exhibition at DIA Center for the Arts across the street, followed by a presentation of his 7-channel video architecture, Mapping the Studio, where we take the perspective of a static camera recording visual and oral activities in the artist studio at night. When DIA Beacon opened in 2003, a rotating display of Nauman's work was installed in the building's lower level and remained of view through 2019. In Mapping the Studio, the star is the decor. It is all ambient noise. Yet by habit, we expect an event, a figure surfacing against the background. And Nauman even affixed a corollary list of such occurrences to each of the videos that constitute the work. This quasi-physiological expectation reminds us of Paul Pfeiffer, whose magical media manipulations have defamiliarized intuitive relationships of foreground and background in ways that profoundly recalibrate our very Western sense of self. Part anthropologist and part editor, Paul tackles the interplay between forms of image making and forms of socialization in a focused set of media works packaged within deeply seductive technologies and architectures. This year, one of the most arresting experiences was entering the vast space of Mocha Geffen to visit Paul's survey and being left breathless. The heavy patter of Los Angeles February rains faded into the clamor of crowds, the occasional ghost punch, and well-timed stadium songs, as my senses were being rewired by the spatialized impact of the exhibition. The hangar was partitioned according to a machine logic of loops and closed circuits, and the individual works were sequenced so that, once fully toured, the impression of the cross-plan of a Romanesque cathedral would be imprinted onto you. Through a sequence of stage sets and their superimposing soundtrack, displacement and fragmentations radically added up to the anxiety of the figure in the global media spectacle. And that unsettled figure is you. There is no center, no measure, no subject in Paul's masterfully edited theater. Paul works constantly, and the only way to keep close to him is to work with him. And so I sought opportunities to collaborate with Paul at various stages of my career, and over years of dialogue, I could observe Paul's mind in motion. Everything is scripted, and this is so foreign to me, are some of his most frequent comments when observing, say, a sport event. You learn that a conversation with Paul has its own unique patterns. His hesitancy is always honest and can be confused for a direct question, but then is not really seeking for an answer per se. I do not want to interrupt you, but is one of Paul's most frequent interlocutions, implying, you've said it already at some point in the sentence, let's take that glyph and stitch it onto the next, let's cut. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Paul Pfeiffer and Bruce Nauman.
Thank you, Matilda. Yeah, this is a great opportunity to do this, and like a much bigger can of worms than I anticipated, even though I knew it would be. So this is definitely a work in progress. In some ways, I'm trying to synthesize things I've been thinking about for like decades, and realizing there's a way in which Nauman embodies so many things. So to try to synthesize it all was like, I literally needed the 6:30 deadline to like force my brain into synthesizing mode. it's going to be partially improvisational. But the questions are real. Okay, so oh yeah, and thank you to Carlos and Alex especially, who are helping me pull together the slides up until this moment. This is just a YouTube video to go along with my intro. The idea of doing a talk on Bruce Nauman, the idea of doing a Bruce Nauman talk at DIA originated in an earlier invitation I received last December to contribute thoughts on Nauman for a catalog accompanying a survey show of his work at Tai Kwun Art Center in Hong Kong. Apparently the most comprehensive Nauman survey organized in Asia to date. The organizers explained to me that rather than simply plop a Nauman exhibition down in the middle of Hong Kong like a franchise, my words, not theirs, their aim was to use Nauman as a kind of armature to stage a series of dialogues meant to amplify the voices and perspectives of artists in China and the surrounding region, artists variously exploring, like Nauman, the plasticity of space, time, language, voice, perception, embodiment, meaning, etc. Alongside artists like Cao Fei, Ellen Pao, Samson Young, and Zhang Peili, they invited me to participate. Later, I'll get into like why they invited me to participate. And it seemed like an intuitive fit. I was intrigued by the idea of using a canonical figure like Nauman as an armature, or a scaffold, or a screen, like a medium in a seance, to invoke less familiar, less heard voices. I was curious about what would result from such a miscegenation. So earlier this year, I sat down with Ingrid Chu, an assistant curator from Tai Kwun, to record an interview. We talked for several hours. Afterwards, one thread of the conversation in particular stuck in my head. It was about a quality in Nauman's work that seemed particularly American. A kind of casual, confident assertion of personhood, as though the sensibility of like already assuming one's body and one's subjectivity to be, in a way, universally like recognizable. In a way, it made me think it's analogous to how I intuitively approach public figures like Michael Jackson as a kind of material, or Justin Bieber, or many others like sports stars. It's an idea that in some ways these figures have already been consumed by the mass media, and they exist in our collective consciousness in a state of kind of being already processed as an image. So that's a quality I associate with Nauman, and as I did a deeper dive in preparation for this talk, it became clear how sort of consistent a kind of intuition about the way in which his body, his subjectivity could be a kind of material that would be almost like the purest kind of material, ready for a kind of like one-to-one recognition with all else stripped away, almost kind of like a really minimalist, the sensibility of minimalist sculpture, somehow embodied in the artist's own personhood. I also, in preparation, watched YouTube videos of about 15 different other artists talking about Bruce Nauman. And so I know that he must be one of the most often sort of analyzed artists by other artists. And in particular, I came across a YouTube video, part of a series called Archive for the Future, produced for a retrospective of Nauman at Palazzo Grassi in Venice, in which the artist Ralph Lemon talks about the first time that he encountered Bruce Nauman's work, and in a way had a kind of revelation about the way the body could be used. And the way he puts it is that it was kind of a liberating moment, like of recognition, and it had to do with a kind of what he perceived. I'm sorry, I putting words in his mouth, but the idea was that there was a kind of sense of freedom to of movement in this way in Nauman's work that Ralph Lemon was saying he felt was particularly American, and in a way particularly white male American, like a way of carrying oneself that in a way wouldn't intuitively occur except to someone sort of living inside a kind of universal body already. So at the same time that, like, in a way I think of Nauman as particularly pure in terms of a kind of like self-assertion of a kind of like artists' role as a kind of like creator. Really like the artist as protagonist with a capital P. In a sense, in a culture of individualism, it makes me think that the artist is in some ways the individual writ large, almost like the exemplary embodiment of what individual agency is. So in some ways, this again is what makes him somehow, to me, like very American. And yet, what he performs over and over again is a gesture of what I would call self-evacuation. So it's a strange contradiction, this kind of self-assertion of a particular kind of like democratic free individuation and self-invention put to the service of a kind of enigmatic poetry of self-emptying. And he does it in a number of ways. I'm very interested as somebody who like struggles with sculpture, and that he does use so many different media, and in particular, there's a couple of things I was thinking about in terms of sculpture. The indexical cast, and a play on the relationship between the figure and the armature. in a way, I've always thought, looking at figurative sculpture historically, that there's this way in which every figurative sculpture has to have some kind of armature, whether it's a kind of supporting structure, like a pedestal that the figure sits on, or even just say like the wall, or the room, the space around the figure, that there's always a mutually constituting relationship of positive and negative of the figure and whatever is the opposite of the figure. In a sense, the figure couldn't be visible if it were not for the pedestal that the figure stands on. And yet, in Nauman's work, the self-evacuation for me is sort of typified by a way in which the figure and the pedestal fuse, and so that there's this kind of constant reiteration of an ambiguous kind of half figure, half scaffold, like part machine. And I actually was thinking of two early videos, one featuring the simple action of a manipulation of this T-shaped bar. To me, there's a sense in this and virtually all of his other works of the kind of reduction down to kind of the most minimal elements, and what's left is a kind of a system like a grid or a Cartesian space, and the elements of that system are all grid-like in the sense that they're carrying out a logic which has to do with a kind of navigation or a measuring of the space of the room, and also the kind of the limits of the body. There's a lot of systems thinking to me in what's happening intuitively, and maybe for later, one of the many kind of like amazing details is the discovery that in the early 60s, all the minimalists were reading a book from the 1930s called, I think, Communications and Systems, like a seminal book on systems thinking. Anyway, this next video, I'm like moving so fast that I don't have the full title, but Beckett is invoked in the title of this piece. And I was just interested in how like the T-bar disappears and now his body is the T-bar, which for me just illustrates the kind of the equivalence of his own body with the space of the room, the T-bar, and the grid as kind of these universal elements. So, another thing is the loop. Virtually all of the videos have this kind of looping structure to them. And I mean, it's something that, has been discussed in many ways. Like, there's another artist whose name I'll remember later, who does a lot of animation and compares the temporality of Nauman's videos to the temporality of Beckett's plays, in which the action goes nowhere, and in a way, like another kind of gesture of self-evacuation. Many of these videos are, they continue, in this case, just bouncing in the corner, goes on and gets louder and softer for an hour. Apparently, well, I think because the duration of the first portapacks were an hour. Another kind of systematic reduction to this kind of minimal, formal economy. I guess the thing I want to say about the loop that relates to how I think about self-evacuation, which I'm kind of purposefully using as a kind of like very suggestive term, especially in combination with the notion of Nauman is almost like the ultimate protagonist of contemporary art post-war. It seems like a huge contradiction that, in a way, the loop for me relates to two things that have a kind of psychoanalytic or psychological dimension to them. One is that I associate the loop in psychoanalysis as having to do with a repressed trauma, the repetition of patterns of behavior, for example, uncontrollably, are the classic indication of something that the subject has repressed because it's too traumatic to deal with, and is therefore sort of doomed to repeat, locked in a loop. At the same time, in behavioral psychology, the loop is a mechanism, the repeated sound or a repeated pattern of light, that's often used to induce alpha brainwave state, which is the state of the mind at its most receptive. When you do, say, like regression therapy, a form of hypnosis, the loop is used to bring you into the alpha brainwave state, at which point you then are able to trace back and back and back to a kind of original trauma in order to, like editing a film, re-edit the memory, so that when you come back out, you don't necessarily remember anything, but your sort of subconscious animal brain, having been rewired, literally responds simultaneously to the, what's the word with Pavlov's dog? The stimulus in a new way. So the association of the loop with something like trance state, altered state of consciousness. Also, of course, thinking about things like the chant, um, or like the whirling motion, all mechanisms to induce altered state of consciousness are associated with the loop. In a way, it is, in being at its most receptive, the brain becomes most like a computer in a way. No longer a personality as such, but almost like a kind of a mechanical operation, easily rewired. So those are some of the things, but in some ways I feel like what I'm trying to do here, and the thing that I'm picking up in Nauman that I'm only kind of, the next time I do this, it'll be more developed, but I, wanted to meet the occasion and at least show you my findings up until this moment, as much as I could synthesize. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and kind of restart from a more personal angle. There is a kind of a lecture like this that I gave in 2006 at the New School on a prompt from Sculpture Center, a kind of personal history of sculpture, in which I brought a few things together, and it was an important moment for me to kind of synthesize a kind of collage of seemingly disparate elements. And for some reason, it was not recorded. So I'm going to repeat some of that lecture. I was 10 years old the first time I was possessed by the devil. It happened in a small city in the Philippines called Dumaguete on the island of Negros, where I was in 6th grade at what was in fact the historic American university, I believe the oldest in Asia, a place called Silliman University. One night I was jolted from my sleep in the early hours of the morning by a terrifying feeling. I woke to find my room and my body completely out of proportion. My head and my hands felt too big for my body, like balloons. My heart was racing, and as I looked around the room, my sense of space became monstrous and terrifyingly strange. My vision felt decentered, like I was floating outside my body. Everything around me was small and far away, like I was looking through the wrong end of a telescope. Or maybe it was that the room was looking at me. It was full of a presence that was penetrating me with a stare that seemed to come from every direction. I jumped out of bed and ran out of the house, and barefoot in my pajamas, instinctively began walking in the direction of sunrise, and basically kept walking until dawn started to break, at which point I went back in my house, back to the house. In a way, it was a formative experience. It sort of made me aware that such states of disequilibrium and disorientation were possible. I didn't understand it. But Silliman University is a Christian university, and this was in the mid-'70s, around the time that The Exorcist came out. So I was certain that I was possessed. So in a sense, a lot of what my thought process has been since then is trying to understand that experience. And I've been collecting notes on things that I find that seem to relate. So I want to read a few. The first comes from a 1935 essay by the surrealist anthropologist Roger Caillois. And he's writing an essay I'm sure some of you know, which is focused on the camouflaging behavior of insects and other animals. And it's a pivotal essay because he takes a critical stance against Darwinian evolution. He says that the standard explanation for why an entity would have a kind of like natural response to mimic its surroundings has to do with natural selection and survival of the species. But he then goes on in the essay to cite a number of different scientific journals that observe insect behavior of intense exertion of like energy and resources to create mimicking effects that have no apparent connection with with survival. I won't go into it, but there are examples where the mimicking behavior actually increases the risk of the predator discovering the prey. So survival cannot be attributed to such cases, and yet they exist. So he surmises that in a way it's our kind of like insistence on humanizing everything that leads us to assume that survival of the species is the cause of such behavior. And he proposes instead that there is something like a kind of innate drive to simply mimic the other that constitutes actually something that might be like a pleasure effect, an aesthetic pleasure derived by the organism from the simple act of mimicry. So in the course of this strange essay, he, at some point, there's a footnote where he, well, not a footnote, there's a section where he then turns to some literature that has to do with the kind of spatial experience of schizophrenics. And so what he says is observations published in the medical literature, for example, with the invariable response of schizophrenics to the question, "Where are you?" I know where I am, but I do not feel as though I'm at the spot where I find myself. He goes on, to these dispossessed souls, space seems to be a devouring force. Space pursues them, encircles them, digests them in a giant phagocytosis. I looked it up. That's when an amoeba swallows a bacteria. It ends by replacing them. Then the body separates itself from thought. The individual breaks the boundary of the skin and occupies the other side of his senses. He tries to look at himself from any point whatever in space. He feels himself becoming space, dark space, where things cannot be put. He is similar, not similar to something, but just similar. And he invents spaces of which he is the convulsive possession. It's like 1935. The next thing is from Walter Benjamin, Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, 1937, 2 years later. The feeling of strangeness that overcomes the actor before the camera, as Pirandello describes it, is basically of the same kind as the estrangement felt before one's own image in the mirror. But now the reflected image has become separable, transportable. And where is it transported? Before the public. Never for a moment does the screen actor cease to be conscious of this fact. While facing the camera, he knows that ultimately he will face the public, the consumers who constitute the market. This market, where he offers not only his labor, but also his whole self, his heart and soul, is beyond his reach. During the shooting, he has as little contact with it as any article made in a factory. This may contribute to the oppression, the new anxiety, which, according to Pirandello, grips the actor before the camera. And then from 1952, Frantz Fanon, Black Skin, White Masks. In the white world, the man of color encounters difficulties in the development of his bodily schema. Consciousness of his body is solely a negating activity. It is a third-person consciousness. The body is surrounded by an atmosphere of certain uncertainty. I know that if I want to smoke, I shall have to reach out my right arm and take the pack of cigarettes lying at the other end of the table. The matches, however, are in the lower drawer on the left, and I shall have to lean back slightly. And all these movements are made not out of habit, but out of implicit knowledge. A slow composition of myself as a body in the middle of a spatial and temporal world. Such seems to be the schema. It does not impose itself on me. It is, rather, a definitive structuring of the self and of the world. Definitive because it creates a real dialectic between my body and the world. Then going back to 1903, W.E.B. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folk. It is a particular sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. Whenever feels this two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. This is the part where it's going to become improvisational. I wanted next to bring up an essay that I encountered years ago and keeps coming back to me. It was written in 1976, Rosalind Krauss, Video, The Aesthetics of Narcissism. I think one of the first treatments on the new medium of video, and certainly, like, in my opinion, somehow foundational and very like prescient even now. And she starts out in the essay by sort of reviewing the inheritance of, or the legacy of the critical and ethical logic of formalism, and describes it by saying that the ethical structure is the one that reveals its framework, its substructure. And so, you know, all of the minimalist paintings of, and geometric abstract paintings of the time were meant to always point towards the center of the canvas, because that would simultaneously point to the edges of the canvas, and rather than creating a window or the illusion of a window looking out, would simply reinforce a kind of awareness in the viewer of the structure bar, and that what you were looking at has a substructure to it, an armature. And so the ethical aesthetic response to image making is to reveal the armature. So then she turns to video, and in particular, I think the first video that she looks at is by Vito Acconci pointing at the camera, probably for an hour, but I don't know. But he basically stands with his finger pointing directly at the camera so that you see his hand and finger, fully foreshortened right into your face, like it's poking your eye. And so what she's trying to do is basically apply the logic of kind of ethical conduct in formalism to this new medium. And what she finds is that it's very hard to kind of determine what exactly the substructure is in the case of video. She sort of reviews all the elements of the setup. There's the projector, of course, but the projector, in a sense, is a variable and could be at variable distance, and is also something that is both brand new and already changing constantly, such that it can't really be considered a kind of stable base for the image. It's too variable. And the same is true of the projection screen. It also is a variable. And the light that's transmitted to make an image, or say the CRT tube that creates the image, all of these are variable. The image can move from one device to another. So you can't say that that there's a kind of consistent base in any of it. So she ultimately comes to the conclusion that the equivalent to the stretcher bar or the substructure of video is in fact human psychology. The receptor, the viewer as receptor, is in fact the location of the substructure of video. Which for us today, with the emergence of AI, it all makes sense now. But in some ways, I find it fascinating. I was going to start the lecture by referencing the Filipino journalist Maria Reza, who won the Nobel Prize in, I think, 2019 for the journalistic work that she did to track the ways in which the regime of President Duterte in the Philippines was using Facebook and social media to control public perception of what was going on. And she was famous for saying, the Philippines is a small country, but you should pay attention because the experimentation around the uses, the deployment of social media in this way, it's being tested in places like the Philippines, former US colony, but it will eventually be deployed in your neighborhood, so you should care. And she also said Facebook is a form of, she's famous for saying Facebook of behavior modification. So, I wanted to bring up another essay that I found written in, I think, 1980 by Katie Nolan. The aesthetics, towards a meta-language of evil. It's a very strange essay that starts out talking about or exploring the ways in which in the 80s the tabloids constituted a kind of like infrastructure for sort of social puppeteering and gaslighting. And she provides examples and specifically talks about the TV shows Dallas and I think Falcon Crest as examples of shows in which all of the characters within the show exist in this kind of sort of vicious interrelation with each other, in which they're all in various ways using the mass media to both gain advantage and to sort of control others. And she then segues to talking about the kind of behavioral patterns of the psychopath. And the way she describes it is that it's something like a predator-prey relationship, which always struck me in terms of like how it connects then to the scene of the camouflage behavior in nature. But what she says is that the thing about the psychopath is that in a way they lack a kind of normal affective mechanism. And so they don't feel in the same way, but they are very keen observers. In a way, they're aesthetes, and so they become masters of mimicking affective behaviors, and so that they can reproduce a kind of like gesture of normalcy. And this is a screen that's used in order to play a kind of highly aestheticized game of cat and mouse. And so in the midst of this description, she then brings up a thing that she calls the mirror object. And thinking about her own sculptures, I find her like description of the mirror object at this point to be totally fascinating, because in some ways I think she's describing, the found object, and she says, as much as possible, when the psychopath is kind of creating the mirror object as part of this game of cat and mouse, the kind of like the observation of and ultimately the simulation of the normal object in its kind of daily existence is so pure that it constitutes a kind of Zen in a way, almost like imperceptible, the objectification that's going on. It's such a complete simulation. And she actually gives the example of a train station that was created at Treblinka and was purposefully designed to mimic a commercial train station, so that as trains were arriving, nobody would be aware that they were entering into a concentration camp. And so she points to this as an example of of the mirror object. And in this, I just want to say there's something so interesting to me now in thinking about the emergence of a kind of video as a new kind of moving image, one that gives instantaneous feedback and is therefore for Rosalind Krauss like a mirror, and in a way gives you what appears to be a reflection of yourself, and then via Katie Nolan, The Mirror Object. And in some ways makes me wonder about a kind of like connection between a kind of minimalist sensibility in sculpture and in performance or in video. There's actually an amazing 1-hour lecture that happened here at DIA by David Levine, in which he looks at Nauman in relation to kind of techniques associated with the study of acting, and the ways in which like processes of self-evacuation as part of like techniques from the 70s to teach acting would include things like the endless repetition of a word. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, to make it, to evacuate it of meaning, and in a way to induce, again, something like a trance state that would, I guess the idea is, turn the actor into a kind of empty vessel, you know, then receptive to take on and simulate the character. I have a friend who's an actor, and I happened to be at a dinner with him just last week, and I asked him, did you study acting? And he was like, no. And I said, do you feel like when you act, you empty yourself? And he said, no, it's totally the opposite. I use my entire affective being to project this other character. So, yeah, that was surprising to me. I actually could go on, but I kind of feel like I want to stop. But if I could, I just want to say that, like, for me, there is this question. Like, in some ways, I didn't say this at the beginning, but you know, like when I was thinking about Nauman in Hong Kong, I was really thinking about what it would mean for this this artist who makes these gestures that, in my opinion, are quintessentially American, and possibly, like, you know, thinking about what Ralph Lemon said, like, you know, possibly quintessentially white American, and how that would be transmitted to another context, like China, where in a way there's not the same kind of, like, say, cult of individuality as there is in our culture. So there's this question for me about, like, how Nauman reads, and that, and in a way, the idea of the kind of, like, series of dialogues with Asian artists from the region in relation, thinking through Nauman's work, including my own, is potentially, like, really exciting, because it, in a way, it would reveal potentially, like, hidden aspects of the kind of ontological system that we're immersed in, by virtue of, you know, being like kind of wired differently or something. So in this whole kind of, like, there's in some ways, to me, there's a question at the heart of the kind of, like the honing in on the ontological system that we're in via a kind of minimalist ethics of formal play, be it with language or with sculpture or with a moving image. In a way, we're peeling back the layers to reveal the hidden structure. And there's a question for me about what that hidden structure is. And in some ways, the main question that I have is that in many of the accounts there's a kind of like existential questioning that goes on, a kind of like ontological questioning that appears to point towards a kind of ground zero, like a universality underneath it all that constitutes a kind of common pattern. And this is the part that I couldn't fully grasp enough to like bring into the room fully, but I just want to leave there. There's an amazing essay that I reread a couple of times while preparing by Fred Moten called On Black Monin. And just a short phrase, there's many kind of things going on in the essay that I wish I could talk about, but he talks about like a desire to, that this essay is part, maybe the beginning part of an attempt to formulate or to invoke a future new idea of universality to replace a false one that we're currently inheritors to. And the way he puts it is that his essay is at the service of a challenging of ontological questioning. And I wish I could say more about it, but I just found that this is another like poetic utterance that's stuck in my head now, living rent-free. And I feel like I have to repeatedly read this essay, and each time I read it, I feel like my brain is being rewired a little bit more via the poetry of Fred Moten's sentence structures. And but this double negative of like a challenging of ontological questioning seems to point to some other way of understanding the substructure in a way that is no longer a dichotomy between, say, background and foreground, or like figure and system, or individual and collective, but that they would be revealed as something not actually in opposition or in a kind of dichotomous relationship to each other. And I'll just mention one more thing, which is another book that I've been reading is one that was introduced to me by Lotus Kang when I told her I was doing this presentation, and that I had this idea that there was something almost Buddhistic about the gestures of Bruce Nauman, this kind of like continual self-evacuation that he performs, and Lotus was like, yeah, you should read Byung-Chul Han's book Absence, and so I have been reading it, and I expected in some ways, it's a study of kind of Western ontology, and he argues Western ontology is fundamentally based on presence, and he says that Asian ontology is fundamentally based on absence. But the deeper you get into it, you discover that it's not a dichotomous relationship, because in fact, in an ontology in which presence is primary, absence is just the opposite of presence, as in like foreground and background. And so what he's talking about as this other kind of ontology is actually something more like indistinction, where there just simply isn't a kind of fundamental like pattern of thinking things as like on, off. Now I'm really stopping.
Thank you, Paul, for this very generous presentation. Paul will take a few questions, in addition to his own questions.
Probably about 20 minutes. And the thing was like, it was unbelievable enough to me that I never told anybody about it as a child. And so in a way, there was like, a substantial period where I was, in a way, just sort of dwelling in this kind of, in this situation of like, I guess, fear that it would happen again. Because I thought, I just felt like I wouldn't even know how to explain it.
I saw your survey at MoCA, and I don't recall any times where I like located an image of you in the work, or like a self-representation of you in the work. But I also feel like a lot of the subjects you were dealing with, you were using as like a proxy or a way to speak about your own identity. And I just wondered, like, in relation to Nauman, I think the general question is, where do you locate yourself in your own oeuvre?
Well, I mean, in a way, my fascination with Nauman and his kind of sensibility around materials, like the material economy, that he so like kind of forcefully pursues, is something I really appreciate, because in some ways I believe in a kind of material economy myself, and although in a way I feel like I am not into I'm like I have this idea that there's these two things. One is protagonism, and the other is whatever the opposite of protagonism is. But in some sense, I think of it as mediation or facilitation. And the way I would define the two is that the protagonist is a kind of form of agency that lies in its relative visibility. And conversely, mediation or facilitation is that form of agency that its strength has to do with its relative invisibility. I'm a middle child, so in some ways, this idea of kind of like a sensibility which mediates is something that comes naturally to me. And it's always fascinated me that so to go back to your question about where I locate myself, having come of age in the Philippines, like specifically in a small town in the southern Philippines, associated like very directly with kind of the American education movement in Asia. Like I have this idea that the materiality of that location carries the history, and it's led me to develop ways of working in which a significant portion of my production takes place in the Philippines. And not just the Philippines, but for example, right now I'm working on a project that spreads across the Philippines, Mexico, and Spain. And it's an engagement with like multi-generational workshops of religious image makers who are making portraits of Justin Bieber as Jesus. And in some ways, one of the connections I make has to do with this trajectory as a kind of geography associated since the early 1500s with the galleon trade, with ships originating in Seville and stopping in Acapulco and then going to Manila. Really sort of trying to reach China, but somehow really like took root in the Philippines, and that's why the Philippines is so Catholic. So in some sense, I feel like, you know, the entire kind of like historical context and geography is a kind of found object. And so, you know, to collaborate with these image makers is a way of like locating myself in history without having to kind of figure myself as a protagonist. In some ways, I feel like there's certain kind of ready-made protagonists like Justin Bieber, who, you know, I think of him as like on the world tour, similar to Magellan's world tour, who already exist in kind of in video space, pre-digested as an image. So, you know, in a way, there's something almost ethical to be about using Justin Bieber's image in this way.
So I've been really captivated by the shadow that you cast in the corner of the wall, which you won't have been watching, and the resonance of it with the chiming of Nauman in the corner of that join.
Whoa.
Yeah. And it's been very hard for me not to think about your practice of camouflage and to sort of envision your absence and an echo between a different set of pairings between those two figurations, which you've so carefully edited and articulated on the wall there for us to look at as you've been speaking. And it helps me to think about questions that you were just raising at the sort of close of your talk there about interiority, and about a different conception of relationships between presence and absence. It helps me to understand something like the saints and the way that one enters a room that seems to be populated by a kind of intense, tremendously legible articulation of national identity in this moment of England winning the World Cup, which only if one traverses a certain threshold articulates and reveals the presence of an entirely distinctive conglomeration of people who are refracted through an image but who are not themselves figured within it. These kinds of dynamics for me, I think, course through a lot of the work that you've made. I mean, I can readily understand why you've been talking about the Bieber work now in this exact context. And I think there's a kind of plasticity. I found it helpful to be looking at the action of your shadow as I recall the Nauman sculptures, to think even sort of materially about how different works in this particular project also figure a kind of dissolution and dissolving, which can no longer cohere in the kind of very concrete black, white, sharp, dichotomous antagonisms and differentiations that you're pushing away from. And I wonder whether, you know, echoing and resonance and camouflage, whether these aren't sort of modalities that, I mean, they're both tactics of evasion for minoritarian subjects in certain kinds of positions, which I think about a lot in this room and in the context of the history of practices that this building is connected to. But I also think just in terms of understanding the sort of the ways that images and spaces speak, that, yeah, these kinds of dynamics, I feel, articulate a very fruitful connection between these two practices. And I wonder if you might be able to talk a little bit more about this kind of pouring out and diffusion that happens in the visual grammars of so many of your works. The ways that things cross, when one moves across a threshold, a whole set of coordinates get transformed in your practice. And I feel like there's a lot there that we've only just started to touch on. I wonder if you could speak a bit more to it.
I mean, you articulated a lot, so I will say this. Maybe this is an evasion tactic, but just so you guys know, that's my friend Stanley talking. And, he's been staying with me over this past week as I've been preparing for this, and he's been witness to a kind of terror that I've been in. And in some ways, I was thinking about it today, like, in some ways, there's something like a perfect trap about this situation. So I feel like the metaphor of like the two corners is so beautiful. One in video and the other in sculpture. And I don't know, I'm just kind of rhyming with what you're saying, but in some ways, like, I remember looking at a YouTube video of the presentation, a wonderful presentation that Charlene von Heil did on Bruce Nauman, in which she almost like wrings her hand about Bruce Nauman's silence. And she's not the only one. Like, I feel like it's this pattern of like artists who kind of secretly hate Nauman, because in a way, there's something, so in a way, like anything, the more you study it, the more difficult it becomes to grasp. But there's a way in which, he figures so prominently at the center of the practice, which simultaneously, there's this annoying way that he's like, he's like the leading man. This, beautiful 25-year-old, like starring in these like weird films of that enact his disappearance over and over again, and that is particularly difficult to grasp, because there's also there's this like, it's the trap has to do with desire, like a trap that has to do with like a self-identification with the gesture, and in a way, he's sort of like monopolized it so entirely that he turns you into, a victim of his trap. The more you try to study it or like, to appreciate it as an artist. And in some ways I was thinking today it's because, he ultimately is, like the spell has to do with like using the platform of the fully, of like the privileged personhood in order to perform the evacuation. Like, as another artist, you cannot, in a way, talk about it without giving up your own identity, which at the same time, he's lured you into identifying with. So he's like the Medusa or something, and in that sense, similarly with Katie Nolan, there's a sense that she's describing the behavior of the psychopath in order to expose him. And yet, the more you follow her, she's such a close study, and the way that she describes, almost lovingly, the mirror object, you begin to feel like, wait a second. So, I just find it fascinating that in a way, like, part of what we're dealing with entails a definition of aesthetics, to simply, in a way, be able to, I don't know, like on a symbolic level or on a formal level, like capture reality in an aesthetic form. You know, according to Krauss, like is about revealing the substructure and constitutes a kind of ethical position. But there's actually an ambiguity to it, like a deep uncertainty to reveal the hidden structure is neither good nor evil. It's it just simply is, you know, the nature of a certain kind of like ambiguity underneath the kind of like verbal or the categorical kind of facade. And what you do with that is like, you know, a matter of responsibility, and there's no telling.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone, for coming.